Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and big welcome to Freya. We read your book, A Marvellous Light, which I actually have a copy here, and it's not unknown that I often don't. So I've come very organized tonight. We just finished this book. It is the August Gloss Book Club official read, where everybody across the world got to read the book and discuss it, which was really exciting. And I do have a very unusual biography for you because I feel like it tells me nothing about how you got to where you are now. But I would love to read it because it's actually a marvelous biography. But it says, Freya Marske lives in Australia, where she is yet to be killed by any form of wildlife. She writes stories full of magic, blood, and as much kissing as she can get away with. And she co-hosts the Hugo Award-nominated podcast, Be the Serpent. Her hobbies include figure skating and discovering new art galleries. And she's on the quest to try all the gin in the world. She's the author of the Last Binding trilogy, which is, of course, the Marvellous Light is the first book in that trilogy. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
My first question is very obviously, tell us how you got to even sitting down and writing this first novel, because you've written 3 now, but this was your first one. So what does that journey look like?
It was the first book that I had published. It was not my first novel that I wrote, which I think is a fairly common path to becoming an author, that the first book you write is not the one that is the success. I'm fairly lucky. It was only my second book. So I had been writing for a very, very long time. I used to write fiction when I was younger, not with an eye to being published, just I enjoyed reading, so I enjoyed writing. And I started a great deal of books and a great deal of stories and just put them aside as I grew out of the idea. And then I hit my teens and discovered fan fiction and wrote that for about 15 years, just as a way to be creative, put my work out. Again, not trying to break into traditional publishing, just as a way of connecting with other writers. And I think that was really where I learned to write longer things. And then eventually I thought, okay, well, I'm having a lot of fun writing very long stories. I think I may have mastered the art of structure and plot and pacing much more than I could when I was just writing short stories. Why don't I try to write a novel? And I came up with this very ambitious idea for a novel and got about 15,000 words into it and realized I had bitten off way more than I could chew, and I was having a terrible time. And what if I wrote a very silly fantasy romance novel that I had an idea for a couple of months ago and just didn't put any pressure on myself and just wrote it for fun, putting in all the things that I like. And that was the first novel that I actually finished. And that was the novel that got me my agent. So when I finished that book, I had a few friends who are also sort of early career writers who might have been agented but not published, or not quite agented yet, or only had their first book out. And a lot of them helped me polish it up and said, here's how you query agents. We think this is worth reading. And I had a really good querying experience. I ended up with 6 agent offers within about 3 weeks. So I was like, oh my gosh, okay, this is happening. This is it. This is the dream. And I signed with my current agent, who I'm the agent I signed with, I'm still with. And we then completely failed to sell that book. That book was not what publishers wanted. If you've read A Marvellous Light, you probably know that I have a tendency to straddle genre lines in a way that I particularly like, but publishers find it a little confusing. So the first book that I wrote was not something that the market wanted at that point. All of the romance houses we sent it to said, this isn't fantasy romance. There's no dragons, or, there's no magic. There's too much trade politics. It's not really, what is this? Where does it fit? And we sent it to some fantasy publishers who said, there's no magic in this, and it's very clearly a romance novel. Where does it sit? So we struck out with that one. But while we were going through the process of that one dying on submission, I was writing the book that was originally called Foresight and is now called A Marvellous Light. And that was a little bit easier to pitch because my agent had sat me down and said, okay, what ideas do you have? Do you want to be a romance author, or do you want to be a fantasy author? And yes, I know you're going to write both, but you have to decide where in the bookshop you want to sit, because that's going to tell us who we send your next book to. and that will help me edit whatever you come up with next. And I said, okay, great. I have an idea for a fantasy trilogy that is also sneakily a historical romance series, because I really admire what historical romance authors do with their series that have a plot that follows you through 3 or 4 or 5 books, but each book is about a different couple. So you get a different romance each time, but you get a plot that goes across 3 books. And I thought, well, I really like writing individual standalone romances, but I also really like fantasy trilogy. Let's do both at once and make sure there is enough magic and enough plot in there that we can sell it to fantasy houses. So that was what we did. I wrote A Marvellous Light, we published it up, and we ended up selling it to Tor.com in the US. And then after a very nail-biting period of silence, we then got a UK Commonwealth offer from Tor UK. And we've sold a few translation rights since then. I think the only one that's actually been published is the Spanish one, which is just out sort of this week, I think. But we've sold a few other translations as well. So that was the journey. I think as far as a journey towards publication is, it felt long to me because I had been writing for so long, but the journey between writing my first novel and becoming a published author was relatively short in terms of it only being a handful of years, where some authors, that's the part that takes ages, apart from writing the first book to seeing publication. And everyone's got a different journey. I think I really lucked out in terms of a couple of things had come out in the fantasy and romantic fantasy space just before I was trying to get published that had kind of paved the way a little bit. And a few things had come out in the field of queer fantasy and queer romance that were just starting to open that door. And then I just, again, lucked out in that my editor at Tor.com, Roshi Chen, was somebody who I knew had similar tastes. Like, she had read my first book, the one that didn't sell when it first went to Tor.com. She wasn't who we had gone to, but she had read it and really liked it and gone back to my agent and said, do you have anything else that's similar to this? So by the time she was acquiring in her own right, we knew she was the right person to send the book to. So that's the story from how it got to publication.
That's great. I think that pretty much covers actually the first question that we had by email. So I would like to know from that question, from your answer there, if you think that maybe that first book that's sort of sitting after you have a little bit more notoriety, which I'm sure you have now after 3 books, if it could be revived and perhaps published in the future.
It is funny that you say that. I can't make any announcements around that space yet, but that is something that we are very hopeful for to be happening in the next couple of years. So yes, I haven't, given up on it and put it away in a drawer. I still believe in it as a book. I haven't self-published it or done anything else with it. So it is sitting there awaiting the time when we can launch it into the world. And you're right, it's a combination of now having proven myself as having an audience. And so my publishers know that I have a readership who will buy the book. And again, the market has moved on. It's a few years since we initially tried to go out with that book. It's been about 5 years, actually. And the kind of books that are being published in the fantasy space, there is more of a trend, I guess, for romantasy, but also for low fantasy. So fantasy that has lower stakes, less world-ending plot lines. And so I think the book that 5 years ago didn't really seem to fit anywhere now has some very obvious comparison titles and is a little more obvious where it would fit in a market. I think that, in combination with the fact that I'm now established rather than a breakout debut, is going to be helpful there. So watch this space.
That's great. Actually, while we're here, I was going to ask you about this later, but while we're here, there are 2 novels that follow A Marvellous Light. And I just would love for you to touch on, I know the second one is published and the third one is yet to be published, but if you can tell us what characters we're going to see in those 2 books, so that anybody who wanted to learn more, that was one of the discussion questions, is if you could choose some of the characters to learn more about or have a future with, who would those be? So it'd be great to hear from you.
Are you able to tell me which characters people particularly wanted to learn more about so that I can either
the
dash
secretary
terribly or...
The secretary was huge.
The secretary, yep.
Yes. And then
okay.
the sister.
And the sister. All right. good news on both counts.
Oh, good.
So book 2 is A Restless Truth. And this is Maud's book. So Robin's sister, Maud Blythe. She's one of the 2 main characters in this one. And this is a slightly more chaotic and historical romp kind of book compared to the first one. The first book was deliberately a little bit quieter and built more slowly, because I really believe in a book, if you're focusing on characters very closely, then your book should feel like the characters that you are focusing on. And for all that book 1 has Robin as the entry character, Edwin is the character around whom I built the aesthetic and the pacing and the structure and the arc of that book. And I think it's a quiet, intense book because Edwin is a quiet and intense person. Maud is a loud and chaotic person. And so this is a much more of a sort of a romp book. And this is set on an ocean liner between New York and England, very much in the style of the Titanic. So it's not the Titanic, but it's a made-up White Star Line ocean liner that I designed based on the blueprints for the Titanic and some of the smaller ships in that ocean line. And Maud is now being more drawn into the magical conspiracy plot that we start in A Marvellous Light. And she finds herself on this ocean liner having to solve a murder mystery and track down another magical item. And along the way, she meets Violet, who is a magician who has been working in the theatre in New York and is now coming back to England to claim an inheritance. So it's their romance. It's the romance between Maud and Violet. But there's a lot of shenanigans on board an ocean liner, and I had so much fun exploring what you can do with a very large but also closed room thing. So it spins off that kind of closed room murder mystery, but it takes it in a much more fun and chaotic direction. And then book 3, which is coming out in November. This is one of the American advanced copy, so it's a bit more floppy, is called A Power Unbound, where you can read A Restless Truth sort of independently. A Power Unbound is very much the 3rd book in a series. So it pulls together Robin and Edwin again. It features Maud and Violet. One of the 2 main characters of A Power Unbound is Lord Hawthorne, who you meet for one scene in A Marvellous Light. He does not make a grand impression. He comes off as a fairly horrible person. But he shows up again in A Restless Truth as a much more major supporting character, and you meet his love interest as well in A Restless Truth. I had to do the first sort of romance beats of their story layered on top of Maud and Violet's story, because I didn't have room in book 3 to start a romance and also wrap up a fantasy trilogy and also feature all of the other characters from the series on page. So A Power Unbound is Lord Hawthorne's romance and does a lot more of the magical world building as well. Adelaide Morrissey, the secretary, is not the love interest in this, but she plays a major role and shows up a lot more, and you learn a little bit more about her. So she's not going to have her own book, unfortunately, but I agree that she was one of my surprise characters that I really loved on page in A Marvellous Light. So when I brought the action back to England in A Power Unbound, I knew I wanted to have her on page playing a role and having much more of a speaking part. So anybody who enjoyed her, hold out, she's in book 3.
All right. Let's delve into the To A Marvellous Light. Everybody has read it, so we can talk about it a little bit more freer than the other novels. So the book beautifully blends historical fantasy and romance, as you discussed. What inspired you to set your story in Regency era world with magical elements?
Okay, so a little bit of a convoluted story. There is a short version and a long version here. When I was coming up with the idea for A Marvellous Light, the idea about the public servant being made to be a magical liaison, it being a mistake, there being a conspiracy, and knowing who the characters of Edwin and Robin sort of were, when I first came up with that much of the idea, I didn't know what time period I wanted to set it in. I did know I wanted it to be historical fantasy, and I did know I wanted to set it in England, but I hadn't quite decided on the time period. And at the same time, I had an idea for a mystery / ghost story set on an Edwardian ocean liner. And I looked at those ideas and thought, actually, those can be part of the same series. Like, why waste a good idea in a good setting if you've got one? And that was really the deciding factor for why the entire trilogy is in the Edwardian era, which is actually quite a short little time in English history, between the end of the Victorian era and the beginning of World War I. So it's sort of less than a decade in strictly the Edwardian era. And it's got a lot of those end of, like, the Industrial Revolution is well underway. We've got steam trains that we have in the Victorian era, but now we also have motor cars and we have bicycles, and fashions are changing and social mores are changing really quite intensely. And so the more research I did on this area of British history, the more I thought, actually, this is really perfect for what I'm doing, which is writing a fantasy series about the status quo being disrupted and what kinds of people want the status quo to stay the same, and who is searching for power and who is assumed to have power and intelligence and influence and who isn't. And so especially by the time I hit book 3, where I was doing a lot more with the actual politics of the time, I realized it was really a perfect time to set this story because of the echoes it had in what I'm doing with the magic and the fantasy plot. So thematically, that era works really well. Aesthetically, I just really wanted to use the Titanic era ocean liner. And of course, the more I dug into the era, the more the aesthetics became really important. So you end up with things like Penhalick House in A Marvellous Light, which is decorated in the arts and crafts style, where you have the De Morgan tiles and the William Morris wallpaper and the Tiffany lamps. And all of that became very integral to the feel of the books. And then by the time you hit book 2, it's much more of this sort of Art Nouveau. And you can see on the covers for these books, we really dug into the sort of Art Nouveau swoopy nature style in order to bring that aesthetic across. And from there, it was really just a matter of thinking about, okay, well, if I'm creating an underground magical society that exists at this time, in what ways is it going to reflect the social conventions, and what ways will women be thought of? And so in A Marvellous Light, you sort of start to see a glimpse of the ways in which the magical society has just adopted the non-magical society's approach to whether women should be educated and what they can be assumed to do in Britain. And A Restless Truth really digs a bit more into what women have been doing behind the scenes that the men haven't been seeing, and what women are doing currently, and sort of trying to tell the story a little bit more from, actually, this is not just about oppression. It is about women have always been doing things. It's just their stories haven't been told in quite the same way. So a lot went into me trying to pull together that historical time period to weave it into what I was doing with the romances and the characters and the magic. But I think it worked out really well. I was really happy with my choice of that time in the end.
It seems like a huge feat, to be honest.
I'm not a historian. Like, I've never really been a big one for sitting down in a library surrounded by dusty primary sources. So I found a few good resources and read those. And then I just thought, okay, I'm just going to look up details as I need them. And so I would just start to write a draft and go, okay, what did the public service actually look like in England at that time? What actually existed? And which undergrounds can I find a map of the underground in London in this time? And how did women join the public service, and what kinds of positions did they hold? And then, okay, if you were at a fancy house party, what would you be having for breakfast? Mm-hmm. And would that vary depending on the social level that you were at? So that was a lot of fun. And then by the time I hit book 2, it was really just doing a lot of research on the Titanic. And because the Titanic exists so strongly and looms so largely in our cultural idea of history and disaster history, there's a lot of information out there on those ocean liners that I think probably wouldn't be so publicly available otherwise. So that was fun, trying to just take what I wanted from the Titanic and make my own ocean liner on which a magical adventure could happen.
It does sound good. So let's talk about Robin and John. Obviously, the relationship is central to the book. A very complex relationship. How did you approach creating their dynamic? And a follow-up question to that is, we'd love to know about the spicy bits. I think a lot of people were surprised when they got to the spicy bits.
Yes, I think a lot of readers were a little surprised by the spicy bits. And at every stage in the publishing journey, I kept going to my agent, being like, should I tone these down? She's like, no, they're great. And if the editor doesn't want them, the editor will tell you to tone them down. And I go to my editor, do you want me to tone them down? She's like, no, they're fantastic. It's fine. Keep them in. So I really did feel like I was getting away with publishing a romance novel, because the level of spice is unusual for fantasy, but not all unusual for historical romance. So when I went about creating the relationship between Edwin and Robin, that was really where the book idea started. I had this idea for somebody being sort of fish out of water and coming into a magical society. And so I was thinking about who would be an interesting kind of person for that to be. And being a very obviously bookish person myself, I more gravitate towards the Edwin kind of character. But I thought, if a very sort of curious, bookish, thoughtful, analytical person comes into a magical society, you have the risk of a lot of info dumping, of him wanting to find out everything and think about it very hard. And what if I had a character who means well, but is not really prone to analytical thought and isn't the kind of person who's going to overthink it? He is shown magic. He accepts quite quickly that the evidence of his own eyes that magic exists, and then he just finds everything about it delightful, except for the parts that are trying to actively kill him. And so once I had a sort of idea of who Robin was, I then very deliberately created Edwin to be a good foil to him, because I was writing not an enemies to lovers romance, but sort of a very much opposites to lovers romance, where they are put in a situation immediately that does not endear them to one another because they're meeting under unusual circumstances. They are very different types of people. And then I give them what you have to do in any kind of enmity to lovers romance, which is give them a shared project to work on, to force them to find out more about each other and see each other's strengths and weaknesses and learn to see them for who they are so they can fall in love. So building the dynamic was really just an idea of thinking what kinds of people would bounce off each other in sparking ways to begin with, and then they would have to learn more in order to love each other. And of course, when you're writing a romance, it's more fun to write people who hit each other's buttons particularly well. So for Edwin, you've got Robin represents the sort of unthinking jock who would have bullied him at school, and who he associates with his siblings' friends, and just assumes, I can have a crush on this person from a distance, but they're going to be very unpleasant up close. And for Robin, who puts so much emphasis on truth and not liking people who represent themselves badly or keep secrets, having Edwin keep secrets from him, or intend to use him as a tool rather than as a person, even though by the end of the book, that's obviously not what Edwin's doing. You have to build in these aspects of it that mean they can assume the worst about each other and they can hurt one another very badly. So if you're writing a good romance, I think for me, the key is how do they have the potential to hurt one another very profoundly? But what is it about each other that they see as complementary, and that once they can work through that, instinctive desire to hurt will leave them realizing that they are perfect for each other. So I do that when I'm building all of my romance plot lines. But it was really fun to do it with Edwin and Robin, because that whole idea of the sarcastic, bookish person and the more jock-like person was a fun dynamic to put on the page and generate plot as they move through the book.
We had a member come to book club and she hadn't read the book. And after she heard our discussion, she was like, okay, I'm going to go home and read it, but can you also tell me the pages where the spicy bits are?
Okay, the pages where the spicy bits are, so you can find them?
I think she just wanted to read the spicy bits.
Oh, well.
After our discussion, she's like, I'm going to go read the book, but I need to read the spicy bits first. She was very intrigued.
Oh, I mean, I feel like I would be betraying my book to tell you so you can read them first.
No, absolutely. We told her where the time. Don't worry.
It's usually, look, it's a romance novel. You can usually open a romance novel at about the midpoint and you will probably hit the first sex scene, and that holds true. Like about the midpoint, something happens where they're put in peril, and it heightens the emotions, and that sort of is one of the triggers for them finally acting on the attraction that has been slow burning through the first book. And then there are a couple of other sex scenes in the latter half of the book as well. I love, obviously I unapologetically really enjoy writing and reading spicy scenes in books. I did really work hard to try and make sure that each one was doing something very specific when it came to character and relationship development, because, you can have 4 or 5 sex scenes where basically the same thing happens and the people haven't actually moved on from how they feel about each other, how they feel about sex, how they feel about their bodies, how they feel about the context in which this is happening. And that's fine. Like if you just want to have it there for a sex scene, that's fine. But I get a look, for me, all the power of a sex scene is, what is this doing? What does this mean to the characters? And how is that changing? And how is it moving the relationship along? So writing the sex scenes was really fun, because I was thinking, okay, whose point of view do I need to be in? Because what am I showing them, experiencing and thinking that is moving them further down the path from, I am a queer man in Edwardian England, this is dangerous, to this is somebody that I am attracted to but I can't act on, to, well, now we're acting on it, but what does this actually mean in terms of the future? And that progression really informed, really on a nuts and bolts level, what happens in those scenes and the things that they allow to happen in terms of vulnerability. So for Edwin in particular, that's really, really important. The ways in which he changes across these sex scenes is the extent to which he allows himself to have what he wants and allows himself to be vulnerable and allows himself to accept pleasure rather than just giving pleasure. And you don't see a lot of it happen the first time, because in some of the scenes you are in Robert's point of view and you don't really realize what's happening until later on in the book, when he has the recognition and the realization that, oh, actually what was happening there was a bit different to what I thought. So, if I can overthink a scene in my book, I will, but I think that the sex scenes deserve a lot of thinking, because yes, they are there to be enjoyable and level titillating, but they are also there for the characters predominantly.
I would love to know, because gender obviously plays a role in this. Like you said, we have 2 queer men, and you're writing sex scenes. Was that difficult? Was that challenging, or?
Not really. I think, well, obviously, again, on a very shallow level, I had come up through fan fiction and I had written sex scenes between pretty much every permutation of gender. And when I'm reading and writing romances, I'm never really thinking about it from a self-insert perspective. Like a lot of people, when I talk about romance, like, when I read romance, I try to relate to one of the characters, and so that's why I find this challenging or that challenging. For me, it's really just, I have created 2 characters and I really just want them to bang. Like that's what I want. This isn't about me, it's about them. And the fun then is creating the dynamic and that character and bringing those 2 characters to that place. So I don't really see a great deal of, obviously there is a difference because of everybody comes to sex, some kinds of preconceptions and baggage related to their gender and the society in which they live, and a sex scene between 2 men in 1908 in England is going to be very different to a sex scene between 2 men in 2023. Think about gender and sexuality and risk and vulnerability. But at the same time, for me as the writer, it's all about who these people are. And so writing the sex scenes in A Marvellous Light, and then writing the sex scenes between 2 women in A Restless Truth. And I've written other books that are not published that have sex scenes between a man and a woman. And I don't really feel that the challenge is in the anatomy and what goes where and which acts are being performed on who. The challenge is, who are these people and what does this act mean to them?
We have a question here from Donna. She says that she tuned in no, we haven't asked this, Donna, but she said, after I had read the book, I wanted to know more about Robin's parents and Edwin's upbringing, especially details with his brother. I can't remember the old woman's name right now, but she left her estate for Edwin. Do you have any thoughts on writing a prequel? And then she just writes, sorry, I meant to say I was interested in the old woman's backstory.
Okay, Donna, fantastic news for you. So the old woman who leaves her estate to Edwin is called Flora Sutton, and I can't spoil too many things that happen in A Restless Truth, but you learn a lot more about Flora Sutton. You meet some of the other women who worked with Flora when they were sort of developing their own forms of magic. So it's not a prequel, but there is a chapter, at least in A Restless Truth, which is almost presented like a prequel, where you get a big solid chunk of backstory about Flora Sutton and the other women who have been working back, 50 years ago and are still alive now. So if you are looking for the backstory, that's where you're going to find it in A Restless Truth. You don't get a great deal more about Edwin's upbringing. You get a bit more of it in book 3, but you do learn a bit more about Robin's parents in book 2 in A Restless Truth, because they are also Maud's parents. And you get a sense of the kind of people that they were like from how they have treated Robin, but then you see them again through Maud's memories and Maud's eyes, and learn more about how they treated her and how she grew up. So there's a bit more backstory in that one. Edwin's upbringing and Edwin's family, for the most part, the story moves a little bit away from them. But his brother Walter does come back again in book 3 as well. Everybody comes back in book 3. It's a very busy book. I had to juggle quite a lot of different disparate plot threads, and I probably didn't tie everything and pull everything together to the extent that would please absolutely everyone. But as far as I'm concerned, all the important people are back on page. So good question, Donna. And I, like you, really wanted to learn more about these old ladies after I put them in the first book. So Restless Truth was my way to do that.
I just want to make sure I get all these questions asked from our emails. So for readers who enjoyed A Marvellous Light, are there any other books either written by you? Obviously, you're the next two would be a good place to start, but or other authors that you would recommend as complimentary reads?
Okay. So this will sort of overlap a little bit with talking about what some of the influences were on the book. A Marvellous Light itself obviously sits in that sort of historical fantasy space. It's very, very unlike Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell in terms of vibe of the book itself, but that for me was a very influential work in terms of how much thought and care can go into the world building of a magical world that sits overlapping with a very clear portrayal of a place and a time in history. So if you're into very sort of slow Victorian novels, but you also want the magic and the fae, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is really good. One of my favorite, technically science fiction, but it reads basically like a historical novel, books of all time, is To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis. Connie Willis writes books in the Oxford Time Travel series, where it gives you a future where we are able to time travel, but it's only allowed, this power is only given to history departments, so that they can go back and study the past. And it's about the people who work in the Department of History at Oxford University. And To Say Nothing of the Dog is, again, a Victorian romp where somebody gets sent back into the Victorian era to look for basically a plot MacGuffin, this weird thing that got destroyed when a cathedral was bombed, and he gets caught up in this ridiculous romantic house party adventure with a lot of very silly situations, but it's beautifully written. It's really fun and funny. And I think especially for book 2, that was an influence on the vibe, but it also just is a wonderful feat of historical fun. Other kinds of things. Oh, Zen Cho wrote a couple of books which are Regency fantasy. The first one's called The Sorcerer to the Crown, and the second one is called The True Queen. And I think they are fantastic historical fantasy, really interesting use of the setting, and also featuring protagonists of color, which a lot of classic Regency romance does not. So I really love those two. I think if you enjoyed A Marvellous Light, I would say The Sorcerer to the Crown would be a really good read. And the last one I'll say, my favorite historical romance author is KJ Charles, who writes, again, mostly queer romances, mostly set in the past. Some of them have magic, some of them don't. But if you liked A Marvellous Light, the two I would specifically recommend by KJ Charles are Think of England, which is again set at a house party in Edwardian England, a house party full of terrible people, with a romance happening at the center of it as they try to solve a mystery. So I think that was quite a direct influence on the kind of story and romance I wanted to tell in A Marvellous Light. And The Magpie Lord, which is another romance that's got some magic in it, and it's about curses tied to houses and things. So I think those are the two I would directly recommend if you're looking for something that would be complementary to A Marvellous Light.
Amazing. So many good recommendations. And while we're on the topic, is this your preferred genre, or do you read literary fiction on the side? What is your,
I read,
where do you go for comfort?
Where do I go for comfort? Ooh. Yeah, I have pretty wide taste. Like, I'm never going to read everything that I want to read. I do read predominantly in fantasy, science fiction, and romance, and mostly in queer romance. But both contemporary and historical, and some fantasy romance as well. A lot of fantasy, science fiction. I do read literary fiction. I'm just starting to get into horror, so I'm reading a lot of horror at the moment and having a great time. I don't yet know if I can write horror. I think I'm at this. Clearly, it takes me like a decade of reading in a genre before I actually write the book. So come back in 10 years and I might write a horror book. I like the occasional thriller, but I prefer sort of like really old school classic murder mysteries in the sort of Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers style. I do have a soft spot for really ridiculous historical tomes. So I reread Dorothy Dunnett's Lyman series at least once every couple of years. Very, very influential on me. And my agent can always tell if I'm doing a Lyman reread, because suddenly my prose just spirals out of control and my word counts get ridiculous. And just like, no, stop, come back, discover yourself again. For comfort, I think I reread things in series that have always brought me joy. So I often will reread Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, or reread a Georgette Heyer romance, or one of the Lois McMaster Bujold Vorkosigan books, which is a very long space opera series. Or I'll go back to books that were really important to me in my childhood and teens. So it depends a bit on what I'm looking for out of comfort. I'm usually reading something new, but I have a lot of things that I'll go back to as well.
Before we had anybody join us, you were telling me about your bookshelves and how they are organized. You have a lot of books.
I have a lot of books, and the problem is I just got these bookshelves installed, and I have another set outside in the corridor, which has got the first half of the fiction alphabet. This is the sort of the second half of the fiction alphabet plus my own books. And then I have non-fiction shelves elsewhere, and I have like plays, graphic novels, poetry also on shelves elsewhere. My book collection is a gas. It will expand to fill the space that is given to it, and I just gave it a whole lot more space, which was very dangerous. But I like having all my books on display.
Very good. So our last question that was emailed in was, your debut novel has garnered significant attention and praise. How has this experience impacted your approach to writing your subsequent works?
That's an interesting one. So I was writing book 2, A Restless Truth, mostly before book 1 had come out. So I did sort of the editing and things while book 1 was coming out, and it's difficult to turn around and point and say, yes, this really influenced me in this direction. And there's a lot of talk out there about book 2, the fear of book 2, because it was actually the first book that I had written on contract with a definite knowledge of this is definitely going to be published. This is definitely the deadline that you have for it. I was a little nervous because I was doing something so different. Like a lot of people would say, there's so much love for Robin and Edwin as characters, and I already knew. I was seeing all these things come out, and I love these two. I can't wait to read a whole series about them. And I already knew that they weren't going to be the point of view characters for the rest of the series. And so I just had to sort of hope against hope that my readers would take it on faith that I was going to introduce them to some new people that they would also love. And also I will bring back the characters that they love. So a lot of it was less about big picture of, oh, and now I'm a bestseller. What shall I do? How will I live up to it? And more about how do I not disappoint everybody for whom Edwin was a really important character. Well, now that I've got all those 3 books and I'm really happy with the trilogy, and I think book 3 is the best of them. And I think people who enjoyed the first two will be satisfied with the ending of the trilogy. Now that I'm moving on to writing other things, I think a little bit of that is creeping back, because I don't want to write the same book over and over, but I also don't want to be, telling my readers, I know you enjoyed all of these things that were in these books. Now I'm writing something that has none of those things. So I am feeling a little bit of a pressure in the balancing act of being true to what people enjoy about my writing, but also allowing myself to go in some new creative directions, write a different shape of book, really. So the book I'm writing at the moment has 5 point of view characters. It isn't structured around a single romance, unlike every other book I've written so far. So I'm taking it a bit more slowly and finding it more of a struggle to fit the pieces together, because it's a different type of book. But I think at the end of it, it's going to be something that I'll be very proud of and that hopefully my readers will enjoy. But yeah, I think the more praise and attention you get for one type of book, the more trepidatious you feel about stepping away from that space and into somewhere new.
And there's no deadline or timeline for the one that you're writing currently, right?
Oh, there's definitely a deadline.
Oh, there is.
There's definitely due at a certain point.
Okay.
Yes. So
are you publishing 2024, hopefully?
2025.
Okay. So you got
yeah, you're in a funny space here with I've got an announcement to make about what I'm doing in the next few years, but we haven't made it yet, so I can't actually talk about it. But I can tell you that the book I'm writing now is the one that is coming out in 2025. Okay. Assuming I meet my deadline.
And just again for our listeners, the third book in the series will be released when?
So the third book in the series is November. It will vary a little bit depending on where you are. I think it is November 7th in the US. Okay. And again, this hasn't been announced yet, but I am actually going to be doing a tour in the US around the launch of A Power Unbound. So, well, please send us that information and we'll make sure our readers get it. Oh, sure, yeah. Not all across the US. I'm only going to a sort of a small place, because I'm going over for a wedding, and I thought I'd just do some events while I was over there. But if you are in Chicago, Philly, New York, DC, or upstate New York, I think those are the places that we're going to have events. We have chapters in 4 or 5 of those, so yes. Excellent. Well, yeah, I will send you all of the details there. I'd love to share it with when that's going to happen. It would be lovely to meet anybody from the book club. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning over in Canberra. We really appreciate, we loved your book, and we hope that you just keep writing and bringing us these amazing characters. And yeah, thank you again. Thank you very much for reading it. Take care.